Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Her Story TV and the Her Story podcast. This is Gertrude Macha here in beautiful Melbourne, Australia. And today I am graced with the presence of yet another amazing man, Member of Parliament, Bruce Atkinson, who is a member of the Eastern Metropolitan Region and a member of the Legislative Council of Victoria. Welcome, welcome, welcome to our tribe. Please tell everybody your full name, where you're based, how old you are, and share your story with us today.
Hello, I'm Bruce Atkinson and I'm a member of the Victorian Parliament. I'm 69 years of age and I'm based in, my electorate office is in Ringwood, but I'm clearly based in Melbourne in Victoria, and I've been in Parliament now for 30 years and prior to that had 17 years in local government here in Nunawading, which is now part of the city of Whitehorse. So 47 years in public service, and I have enjoyed every moment of it, principally because of the inspiration that I've drawn from so many wonderful people along the way.
Now, I have noticed that the state of Victoria has a very big drive to be inclusive, to expand the reach in all the ethnic minority groups across the state. Now, why is diversity and inclusion so important? And why did you support this initiative?
Victoria is one of the real exemplars of multiculturalism. We have had a bipartisan commitment from the political parties here in Victoria to multiculturalism over many years. It's been recognised that bringing people together in the community and not simply tolerating diversity as happens in some places, we celebrate diversity. We recognise that there is so much that people from different backgrounds, different ethnicities, the different faith communities, different geographies around the world have to bring to the table in terms of sharing culture, sharing ideas, sharing perspectives. And what is really important to us is to make sure that everybody is included at that table, that in fact we don't simply concentrate on some of the larger populations, but also focus on some of the smaller communities and some of the newer communities in particular. Australia and Victoria is the story of this country is obviously very much about migration over just a little over 200 years, albeit that the Indigenous Australians, the First Nations people, have a culture that goes back over 60,000 years and is one that we have come to learn more about, particularly, I think, through the lens of some of the more recent arriving communities to Victoria. So we now celebrate our Aboriginal culture as much as sharing the cultures of so many new communities that have come. Clearly, there was a lot of people who came in post-Second World War migration, and indeed the story of migration to Australia very often has been one of refugees and people who have left their home country because of conflict or because of economic circumstances. Those people have brought enormous skills as much as culture and knowledge to Victoria and have played a very important role in the advancement of this state and this country. And as I said, we really celebrate all of those contributions to what has become a terrific tapestry of multiculturalism here in Victoria. The African communities are among the more recent arrivals to Australia, although obviously there are individuals and some communities that go back many, many decades and indeed into 2 centuries ago when the gold rush really spurned considerable growth in Victoria. But in significant numbers, the African communities have been more recent arrivals into Victoria, and they are a vibrant community that has brought a lot of terrific cultural pollination, but also the vibrancy of their cultures in terms of food and fashion, and again, just ideas. There are communities that are very committed to education, as so many of the migrant communities have been, and they have been very involved in establishing businesses in Victoria, and very successful businesses. And I can see terrific opportunities going forward created by these communities.
So what I have observed, you might not know, I am new to Australia. I've been living in New Zealand for the last 21 years. And so I have immersed myself in finding the African community, volunteering with different organizations. Some of the challenges that are faced by most of the African immigrants is the language barrier. And again, some skills are not directly transferable. Some people were nurses, they were doctors, and when they relocated, they can't get registration, for example, to work in the medical profession. What is government doing to help immigrants who have transferable skills find employment, be viable citizens in this community?
It's interesting that at this time, Victoria in particular has a real issue in terms of skills. We have a very low unemployment rate at this time, nationally and in this state, and we are really in need of skilled workers in so many areas. Some of the areas that have been really important has certainly been health, as well as areas like hospitality and agriculture, manufacturing, and so forth. So there's certainly the opportunities there, and I guess the real challenge for government is to match the gaps with the skills that are already available here in Australia. In many cases, people who are perhaps doing work that was initially the first job, the entry point into our economy and the jobs market, but in fact who already have skills that might well see them transfer into areas that are more aligned with their career experience and their education. The situation with medicine is sometimes quite difficult because international qualifications are sometimes difficult to translate into the Australian requirements. There are many doctors who come from all parts of the world, including Pakistan, India, Iran, and so forth, who have certainly qualified in their home countries, have come to Australia and have been able to have their qualifications recognised after going through a process to establish the qualifications that they have, and more important, any upskilling that is necessary to meet Australian requirements. There are obviously significant opportunities for more doctors coming from the African continent who also have studied in universities, and sometimes in international universities, not just in Africa, but they may well have studied in Canada, the United States, or the UK. So that process of trying to fill the gaps with people who have skills and who have that educational background is really one of the challenges for government. And principally, it's a challenge for the federal government because we do try to have a mutual recognition in most of our industries for professional qualifications, so that if they're recognised in a state like Victoria, they'll be recognised in New South Wales and so forth. I found that particularly people from the African continent have been significantly involved in the aged care sector, and they have made a particular contribution in that area, bringing with them very often skills and educational training. And I don't think that many of those people involved in that industry have really taken up the opportunity perhaps to look at expanding their qualifications further and to move into other areas of nursing. One of the problems with aged care is it's relatively low paid. There's considerable debate on pay issues, wage rates for the aged care sector. And so it's obviously represented a significant entry level opportunity for people from Africa in particular. And we have found that they've been outstanding in terms of the compassion that they bring and the work ethic that they have in that sector. But I do think that there is opportunities for many of those workers to also look to upskill and move into nursing in particular.
That is fantastic. I observed what New Zealand has done. They created what's called the comparable healthcare pathway, where they will allow people who've worked in the so-called first world countries to come in under supervision. And I think New Zealand solved some of its problems, especially in rural parts of New Zealand, in bringing in doctors and nurses, etc. And I think you're right. The opportunity is there for immigrants to go back to college. Scholarships are available. Lots of university opportunities here. So I think it's on us as a people to grab those opportunities and upskill so that we can fit into all of these positions as well.
If I can just go back on one aspect in terms of the upskilling, I would also mention that we're not talking about redoing a whole course. We're very often talking about just topping up the existing qualifications. So it might be a very short, almost a refresher course that simply gets to Australian standards. And one of the other issues that I think is really important in terms of workforce is that I would hope that the new federal government actually reviews the entire visa system here in Australia, because I don't think it's working for anyone. I don't think that it's working for refugees. I don't think that it's working for seasonal workers. I don't think it's working for international students. I don't think it's working for family reunion or business executives. I'm not sure where it's working as it should. And that is an area that I would like to see the federal government tackle as a matter of urgency, which would then also play into this skills shortages and the opportunities for careers and so forth for people from the African continent.
So let's talk a little bit about racism. I know that there have been issues with the gangs that have painted a very negative perception and created a stereotype around African people in general, and in particular, the Sudanese community. What is government doing? What is the city councils doing to protect the innocent? Because there are a lot of people who are caught in the crossfire, who are not involved in these gangs. What is government doing to try and help with that?
In terms of racism, racism is a significant issue at times. It tends to flare, and it tends to flare around particular issues in the community. For instance, the Chinese community in Victoria and Australia went through a difficult period because of COVID. There was a certain section of the community who was blaming the Chinese people for COVID. Now, clearly, our communities here in Australia had nothing to do with how COVID might have emerged, and they were as susceptible as any other community to the challenges of COVID. We also had issues some time ago with some of the Indian community, and that was a matter of concern. So particularly from the Indian community experience, I think we did learn a lot, and I think we've been able to tackle some of the issues in the African community better and more constructively. can I say that I think, from my point of view, the African communities have been outstanding in terms of their contribution to this state and the way in which they have joined with the broader community in terms of participation in the workforce, participation in community activities and social networks and sports clubs and so on and so forth. You know, this has been a community that's been eager to become involved in Australian society, and I think that's fantastic. It's also my experience that with young people in particular, I never cease to be impressed by the quality of young people. The African youth that I have met across the board have been interested in education, have been committed to their education, and are doing some extraordinary things. And I see so many of them coming through in leadership roles in youth communities, but even in broader areas. And I see them also in terms of, you know, the number of functions that I go to, and I see young African people as MCs and as speakers and contributors on panels and so forth, who bring a terrific perspective. And I think I'm very confident about the future of this state and the future of the contribution of the African communities because of what I see in those young people. There have been some isolated incidents of some youth who have been involved in some activities, antisocial behaviour, and extending into criminal activities. I think one of our problems has been historically that we have had people come to Australia, particularly from conflict zones, and Sudan is a particular example, come from conflict zones, and they have been basically brought in by a federal government program, dropped in the suburbs of Melbourne without sufficient support around them. And I find that particularly for some of the African women who have families that they are supporting, often without menfolk, there has been a real stress point and difficulties in terms of meeting the needs of those families and ensuring that their particularly young males, in some cases, have had the sort of role models that are going to ensure that those that have gone off the track a little are actually provided with some guidance and some support. So we really needed to do better in terms of those African youth that had got into strife. We needed to ensure that there were better services around them. We needed to ensure, I think, that even some of the placements of where people were encouraged to settle were better. Because, for instance, from Sudan, we brought people across who had experience in the agricultural industries, in farming, and we dropped them in the middle of concrete jungle suburbs rather than in places where their skill set could be used better and they would feel more constructive and a better part of those communities. What we have done, the government, I think, has certainly worked to create organisations or committees that have involved the leaders of the African communities that where there has been a need to address particular issues. And we have sought the advice of those communities on how we can better address those problems and to address them in a culturally sensitive way, to address them with some understanding of where those young people have come from and the sort of struggles that they might have. There has also been, I think, some attempts for some really terrific programs. I mean, I've got a friend, Selba, in Dandenong, who's done a lot of work in the justice area, yes, but also started the Black Rhinos, which was a basketball competition which exploded from one team to many teams and very successful. And the involvement of young people in sport in that way has actually meant that they have discipline, they understand teamwork, they have skills development, and frankly, they've got no cause to get into trouble because there's a positive in their lives. And the work that Selva's done has been sensational, but it's been done by other organisations as well around Victoria.
I've been actually volunteering at Afri-Oz Care with Salva Gondoza, and she is absolutely amazing. Now, I know that one of the things that Salva is advocating for right now is to try and help those young men who are incarcerated at the moment to ensure that they get correct representation, they get opportunities to study, they get help and support when they come out of prison so that they don't become repeat offenders. What is the state doing in helping and facilitating along those lines?
There are programs, and they're broad programs. They're not necessarily, to my understanding, specific to African offenders that might have been incarcerated and becoming out. As I understand, there are a broad range of programs, and certainly within some of the youth detention centres, there are education programs and so forth. But this is an area where, in all honesty, we have to do better. We have to do better in terms of the educational support that we provide to those young people who are incarcerated. And we have to do much better when they are released, because one of the issues is if they are not given some skills, if they're not encouraged in pursuing their education or pursuing some skills development, then in fact, inevitably they go back to the people that they perhaps were associated with before they got into trouble. And very often that's a pretty dead-end course. It's a sort of a circular situation of going back into difficult circumstances. What we need to do is to break those cycles and to give them more positive opportunities. I know that there are some organisations who are prepared to provide employment for offenders who are released, and who are prepared to skill those offenders in some of the work that they undertake, particularly in some of the manufacturing industry and so forth. We need to do better with those sorts of programs. We need to involve more employers. We need to involve better targeted education facilities. And we also, with some of the troubled youth, we need to identify some of the issues that are behind their challenges. And that can sometimes be undiagnosed mental health issues, particularly where they have come from conflict zones or where their families have been stressed by the circumstances that actually brought them to Australia. You can't simply put all that on and say, well, that's behind us now, we've got a new life. Sometimes those issues are troubling for people for many years. And we know, for instance, in mental health, often those teenagers who have issues with mental health, you can trace it back to when they were 3 and 4 years of age and the circumstances that they were involved in at that time. We have to do a better job in that area as well. And there certainly is a significant Victorian government commitment now to improving our mental health services.
That's fantastic. That's good to know. Now, let's get to know you, Bruce. Bruce, the man, the father, the husband. Who are you? Are you married? How many children do you have? Tell us a little bit about you personally. When I was looking at your bio, I saw that we have a few things in common. I am also a Rotarian from New Zealand. I noticed you are a Rotarian yourself. You have been actively involved in a lot of sports and sports clubs. Tell us a little bit about you and what your passions are.
Yeah, look, essentially, I grew up locally in Nunawading, which is an eastern suburb of Melbourne, and have spent most of my time within a very short radius of where I grew up. And I was a journalist initially when I'm leaving school. In those days, there weren't university degrees. It was sort of like an apprenticeship to be a journalist. And so I worked for local newspapers and became a graded journalist. I then went on to manage shopping centres and got involved in marketing, set up my own business, and was involved in publishing, in public relations and marketing, and particularly in business consulting to the retail industry, which had become a specialisation. And at the same time, I was certainly on the Nunawading Council for 17 years, spent a couple of years as mayor, and entered Parliament in 1992. So I complete 3 decades at the end of this year as a Member of Parliament. I'm married and have 3 children, all grown-up children, and 4 grandchildren. 2 are twins, 1 of each flavour, and the other 2 are 2 years old, and they're both, the twins are 11. The other 2 are 2 years old and 1 year old, and they're obviously a great delight to me. My interests have certainly been in travel, in theatre. I do still write in journalism, business, some business articles, opinion articles, as well as poetry. And I've got a great interest in a lot of sports organisations. Was a long-suffering Melbourne Football Club supporter until last year when they won their first premiership in 57 years. But I've obviously been a strong supporter also of women's sport, and Melbourne Vixens in the netball is a particular favourite team that I support. Melbourne Victory in soccer, and obviously I contribute a lot in terms of support and the necessary assistance that comes from a government level to many local sporting organisations. My own sports history was really in basketball and field hockey.
Fantastic. Wonderful to get to know you a little bit, Bruce. So now let me take you into the future, and let's imagine that time is an illusion. And I'm going to teleport you to the 100-year-old you. And you're now sitting in your rocking chair, surrounded by your children, your grandchildren, and your great-grandchildren. And you're reflecting back on your life and the future that you've created for the next generation. If you could have a conversation with that man, what would you say to him based on how you're living your life right now?
That's a tough one. Actually, I'm all too close to 100 years old now, I think. I guess my approach to life has always been to try and make a difference. And obviously the in brackets bit before difference is positive difference. And I guess what I have always tried to do is to follow ideas. I'm an ideas person, and I'm interested in ideas and in new initiatives that will make a positive difference for people. In politics, I've never been one of those people who has played the man. I've never sought to be a political contestant, if you like. I've tried more to be somebody who's a bit more collaborative and tried to develop ideas through a collaboration and through working together with people. And what I would hope is that we see more of that in politics going forward. I guess in my 30 years in state parliament, I've become a little distressed that I think politics is less fraternal than it was. I think that it's less bipartisan than it was. I think that in most cases it is a lot more aggressive and a lot more antagonistic in its approach between the various members. And I think that the community and citizens lose in that sort of circumstances. I think that from my point of view, and it's interesting having been a journalist as well as a member of parliament, I guess what I notice is that members of parliament, politicians, and I guess people in other fields too, including business, tend to be caught on this 24/7 news cycle and the need to respond to any issue instantly. They don't take enough time to think and to really consider the issue in depth. And what I find is, a journalist, for instance, at a news conference will ask a question and expects an answer. And I mean, if the politician gives that answer instantly without properly reflecting on what the question is or what the issue is, without having all the facts available, then there's a real chance that there's some bad decisions that stem from that bad policy even stems from that, and certainly negative outcomes in the community. I've always said to some of my colleagues that they ought to spend some time, particularly if they're ministers, they ought to spend some time just going away from politics for a day every fortnight or something and spending the time by themselves thinking about what they want to achieve, what the issues are that are confronting them, and using their own personal filter of their experience and knowledge. Because too often what happens is that they are on a treadmill that's created by bureaucracy and by all of the sort of pressures that come about in politics, and they don't get the time to think. And in the absence of them thinking, they don't necessarily question some of the information that comes to them from bureaucrats or even from the community, and to interrogate that information properly with a view to having better policies. So I guess what I'd be saying as a very old man going back to a slightly younger man, take more time to think through issues. Don't react immediately. Take time to mull over and to investigate and to properly understand an issue before you respond. I guess we've got 2 ears and 1 mouth, and it's a good idea to listen twice as much as we talk.
Fantastic. Bruce, thank you so much for this interview. It's been an absolute honor to meet you, to get into your head for a few minutes and find out the man behind the name. Thank you to everybody who's tuned into this podcast today. The Her Story Circle movement is attracting some phenomenal people who are coming online to share their story and their wisdom. Tune in again tomorrow when I come back with yet another amazing guest. In the meantime, have a fantastic day, morning, or evening, wherever you are in the world. And Bruce, thank you again for this interview.
You're very welcome. Thank you. All the best to everyone.